Hi, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone who's made this symposium possible, especially the symposium organizers, Urvashi Chakravarty and Liza for putting together such an incisive set of conversations. I'd also like to thank Ayanna Thompson and the Race4Race board for creating this unparalleled forum for critical work on race and premodern studies. It's just been an incredible weekend with such insightful talks. I'm really honored to be a part of it. In keeping with the symposium theme of genealogies, my talk today considers how early modern English approaches to racial mixing and mixed race identity represent antecedents to approaches from subsequent history. As I argue, the early modern English engaged the topic of mixedness in oscillating, at times conflicting ways. Specifically, the culture's capacity to both recognize and elide dual African and European heritage enabled the English to modulate the terms of racial inheritance, particularly in ways that furthered projects of constructing increasingly rigid racial boundaries. As examples from Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus demonstrate, shifting between acknowledging mixed race identity and eliding it, even at the level of the individual, began to offer means of resituating the parameters of racialized populations. Such strategic oscillations, with their ability to draw and redraw racial boundaries and to determine and redetermine racial demographics, become essential facets of subsequent English colonial projects, as well as of the rise and growth of chattel slavery in sites like early America. They also further demonstrate the peculiar place mixedness has historically and continues to hold for beliefs about how populations were, are, and might be racially constituted. We can look to the 19th century for one such example. In 1850, the category mulatto first appeared on the US Census. 1850 was, of course, far from the first time the racial construction mulatto had been conceptualized, and I'm thinking of in part of this morning's talk by Tamara Walker. Indeed, the challenges dual or mixed African and European heritage could pose for a settler colonial slaveholding society had been adjudicated, quite literally centuries prior, through a range of early American codes and statutes that dictated the direction of racial inheritance to further dispossess the enslaved and further enrich slaveholders. It should come as little surprise then that mulatto's 1850 census appearance had nothing to do with rethinking racial categories in ways meant to challenge the illogical grounds of racial construction. As Kim M. Williams points out, the category was, quote, added initially as a means by which to test Josiah C. Nott's theory that blacks and whites were separate species. As Williams outlines, Nott, quote, believed the progeny of interracial unions to be frailer and thus to live shorter lives. Here, mixed race identity was counted in a way to demonstrate its unfeasibility. In its supposed demographic decline, mixedness would prove the ultimate irreconcilability of black and white. Arguments like Nott's, which envisioned mixedness as unsustainable, were not especially new in the 19th century. Writing in 1774, British slaveholder Edward Long argued that, in his observation, matches between mixed-race people, quote, have generally been defective and barren. According to Long's History of Jamaica, mixed-race people were, quote, mule-kind and not so capable of producing from one another. The evocation of mules here, the offspring of a donkey and a horse, points to the presumed difference in species between African-descended and European-descended peoples, postulated in the biological racist thought most closely associated with the 18th and 19th centuries. While such theorization framed the racially mixed as a waning population, this vision of a shrinking or disappearing demographic was forwarded contemporaneously with efforts to elide the proliferation of mixed-race people, particularly among the enslaved. In short, while racist theory deemed racial mixing intergenerationally untenable, slaveholders had, for generations, economically benefited from the growth of an increasingly racially mixed enslaved population. While biological racists worked to fabricate a more rigid boundary between those deemed black and those deemed white, social practice and legal codes actively redrew those lines, with mixed heritage situated as a site of racial reification. For a white, settler colonial slaveholding society, the reasons for eliding the proliferation of mixedness were manifold. They included concealing the extent of the violence inherent to the slave trade and controlling the terms of racial inheritance, thus relieving paternal responsibility for the perpetrators of such violence, while simultaneously severing access to rights and freedom for slaves who could otherwise claim some European heritage. Such elisions worked in part to stave off the panoply of challenges mixed-race identity also stood to levy against dominant projects of racial construction and their attendant hierarchizing and exploitative regimes. Relatively contemporaneous with the 1850 addition of the mulatto category to the U.S. Census, Frederick Douglass raised some of these challenges in his 1845 narrative. There, he wrote of a slave population that was increasingly and intergenerationally mixed. It is, quote, plain that a very different looking class of people are springing up at the South. Referencing his own mixed background to challenge one justification for African enslavement, Douglass argued that, quote, if the lineal descendants of Ham are alone to be scripturally enslaved, it is certain that slavery at the South must soon become unscriptural. For thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers. Of course, what was plain to Douglass had already been rendered far more opaque in dominant society. It was not as though a construction like mixed-race identity was inconceivable, quite the contrary. Rather, it was, at least in part, I would argue, the capacity for mixedness to be concomitantly elided in dominant society, sometimes even as it was recognized. Indeed, the implications of Douglass's observations that African Americans, for example, might be considered a new class of people, in some sense described a demographic shift that had already been transmuted to suit the needs of a slaveholding society. In many ways, early modern English dramatic representations of mixed-race identity offer conceptual antecedents to such modes of approach. Perhaps most prominently, Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus offers key examples of the long-standing push and pull mixed-race identity has historically engendered, particularly around issues of racial categorization vis-a-vis broader groupings. The only Elizabethan or Jacobean drama known to have staged an explicitly mixed-race character, Titus offers two main antagonists, the Gothic queen Tamara, aptly described as hyper-white by Francesca T. Royster, and the blackamoor Aaron, whose skin color serves as a locus for a range of anti-black aspersions. The pair's illicit affair produces a child, one whose phenotypic non-whiteness means he must be killed or hidden to avoid the Roman emperor discovering his wife Tamara's adultery. In the play's initial descriptions of the child, we can begin to see modes of categorizing mixedness that both capitalize and forward anti-black ideologies. The child is brought to Aaron by Tamara's nurse, who describes him as being, quote, a joyless, dismal, black, and sorrowful issue. Employed here are the binaries of black and white, what Kim F. Hall calls the originary language of racial difference in English culture. Such binaries are concretized through the nurse's qualifying phrase in which she deems Aaron and Tamara's child black, and as loathsome as a toad, specifically among the fair-faced breeders of our clime. In this formulation, the nurse situates not just the act of reproduction, but the phenotype of its participants as in hearing who might be counted among a peoples and who might not. Her formulation not only works to exclude the child from categorization among the Goths, it simultaneously disqualifies the child's father, Aaron, for being a suitable, quote, breeder of Gothic children, as he lacks what the nurse determines is a fair face. Of note here is not only the nurse's espousal of endogamy as a requirement for the reproduction of her people. The contrasting implications of her repeated assertions of the child's affinity with Aaron the Moor suggest that endogamy is not a precondition for the reproduction of black identity. Aaron, in the nurse's framing, cannot produce European children. Tamara, however, can produce Moors. While in the moment the pressing matter racial difference foments in the tragedy is the consequences of adultery for Tamara and her retinue, writ large, the nurse's line of thinking carries considerable demographic implications, stipulating vastly different standards for the generation of black as compared to white people, while concomitantly guarding against the threat interstitial racial identity might pose to broader projects of racial construction. The nurse is not alone in this position in early modern culture. Many of you may recall the well-known Elizabethan observation made by George Best, which bears striking resemblance to the nurse's formulation, with its essentializing one-to-one identification of black parent and black child, as well as its use of the term loathsome to describe darker skin. After seeing an interracial couple in England and deeming their child as black as the father, Best surmises that blackness derives from the biblical kus, thus evoking the curse of Ham, which operates in Best's framing as a, quote, infection. His encounter with mixedness leads best to make the grand claim that, quote, all the whole progeny of Africans descended are still polluted with the same blot of infection, and that, quote, of this black and cursed kuss came all these blackmores which are in Africa. As I've argued elsewhere, we might position Best's postulations along claims made decades later in Shakespeare's The Tempest. There, the at least half-African Caliban threatens that through reproduction with the European Miranda, he would have, quote, peopled the island with Calibans. What Urvashi Chakravarty accurately describes as Caliban's almost parthenogenic fantasy notably sees Miranda's racial and cultural designations reliably erased in a single generation. In its place, Caliban envisions racial alterity proliferating to populate the entire island. Such extrapolations, which extend essentializing estimations as a means to frame broader existing and potential populations, find affinity with ideological and conceptual developments in the colonial era Atlantic world. As Jennifer L. Morgan demonstrates, demography arose alongside Atlantic slavery with its quantification and commodification of Black people and destruction of Black kinship. As Morgan explains, quote, numeracy, fluency in the concept of trade and exchange, as well as attention to demographics, was just one of the many new modes of thinking that accompany the origins of the modern Atlantic world. Racialized demographics, like categories of race themselves, were, of course, constructed, shaped, and reshaped alongside the exigencies of colonial and racial regimes. Such demographic visions could be shifted according to such exigencies, with mixedness acting as something of a fulcrum. Notions of an ever-proliferating Black population through racial mixing, like those forwarded by Best, could be employed to formulate an increasing population of the enslaved. That said, ostensibly contrasting modes of counting mixedness operated concurrently. Titus, for example, demonstrates, however briefly, a concomitant capacity to consider rather than de-emphasize mixed heritage. Before him being captured by an invading Gothic army led by Lucius Andronicus, Aaron is overheard trying to calm his child, saying, "Peace, tawny slave, half me and half thy dame. Did not thy hue betray whose brat thou art? Had nature lent thee but thy mother's look, villain, thou mightest have been an emperor." Aaron's description provides insight into an early modern English capacity to conceptualize dual racial identity, as well as to envision avenues through which such heritage could conceivably grant access to European racial inheritance. There is a differing estimation that I want to mark, a bifurcation introduced by the introduction of the phenotypic descriptor tawny, indicating a broader range of skin color. A means of approach that Noemi and I, in reading this moment, calls a greater sensitivity to racial nuances and hybridity. To be clear, what Aaron proposes here is supplanting a Roman line with a Moorish one, with the hypothetical inheritance of European designation for his mixed-race offspring framed almost as a theft. Aaron's speculation here follows his suggestion that his child be swapped for the mixed-race child of his countryman, Mulattos, a child who can pass for white. Aaron's curious choice to exchange another mixed child for his own as opposed to a white one in some sense only amplifies the notion that permeable racial boundaries inhere uncontrolled access to the privileged class. As Royster explains when asking why Aaron would propose such a swap, Aaron's plan, quote, suggests his allegiance to his race, a commitment to establishing a foothold of power for Moors within the very heart of Rome. According to Royster, quote, most disturbing of all for Elizabethans might well have been the hidden Black presence within the mixed-race child, one that threatened, quote, the potential for a growing network of others. In that sense, the play's capacity for something like racial nuance arises in part to foment the threats mixedness is envisioned to hold for European society, even at the level of its ruling class. It's notable that even as Aaron raises these threats, positioning mixedness as a venue for infiltrating and fundamentally altering Roman society, he subsequently reasserts the presumed surety of white endogamy espoused by the nurse, concluding his pleas to his child with the supposition, "But where the bull and cow are both milk white, they never do beget a coal-black calf." Part of what Titus demonstrates is the utility to projects of racial construction of being able to espouse divergent approaches to mixedness, even concomitantly, to foster different visions of peoples and populations. Consider, for example, the markedly contrasting perspective on racial mixing offered by Edward Long in relation to his home country of England. Long, whose aforementioned argument that mixed-race people were, quote, mule-kind, remained, according to Robert J.C. Young, influential to racist ideology into the 20th century. But that was not the only tack the slaveholder took regarding mixedness and its demographic consequence. Writing in 1772, concerned about an increasing black population in England after Somerset versus Stuart, Long claims, "The lower class of women in England are remarkably fond of the blacks. By these ladies they generally have a numerous brood. Thus, in the course of a few generations more, the English blood will become so contaminated with this mixture. This alloy may spread so extensively as even to reach the middle and then the higher orders of the people, till the whole nation resembles the Portuguese and Moriscos in complexion of skin and baseness of mind." Long's beliefs that mixed-race people are, quote, "not so capable of producing from one another" are entirely contravened here. The slaveholder instead sees the rapid spread of mixedness in the course of a few generations, a contamination that would render the whole nation, including the ruling class, racially blended, such that the English would resemble, in the slaveholder's racist and nationalist framing, the Moriscos or Portuguese. Where the various technologies of chattel slavery, ideological, legal, social, and material, enabled slaveholders to deny and downplay the presence and proliferation of mixedness on the slave plantation, the contravening vision of the exponential increase of a mixed-race population contemporaneously offered avenues to lobby for racial exclusion. As Long's appeal outlines, it would be for, quote, the public good of this kingdom that restraint be laid on the unnatural increase of blacks imported into it. Blatant reversals like Long's demonstrate the deeply conflicting logic undergirding racial projects. And indeed, in societies inured to such racial construction, many such otherwise marked conflicts are resolved. In some sense, we might consider the beliefs motivating the 1850 census inclusion of the category mulattoes as demonstrative of this otherwise untenable resolution. Where, we might ask, did proponents of the degenerating mulatto argument conceptually locate the expanding population of the enslaved, many of whose mixed backgrounds represented centuries of state-sanctioned violence? How was such a legacy so categorically dismissed? And what are the legacies of such erasure? While I've thought more broadly today about how oscillating approaches to mixedness have historically engendered markedly disparate notions regarding racialized populations, I want to conclude with an example of erasure more local to early modern English drama, one with some influence on the lineage of Moors represented on the Elizabethan and Jacobean stage. While Titus Andronicus in many ways offers the most overt engagement with the topic of racial mixing in late 16th and early 17th century English drama, I want to consider the ways in which the first dramatic Moor known to have been rendered on the English stage might also be considered mixed. At the opening of George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar, we are introduced to the villain Mully Muhammad, framed by the play's presenter as, quote, the barbarous Moor, the Negro Mully Hammad. Described as, quote, black in his look and bloody in his deeds, Mully Muhammad's racial blackness is rendered in the play as a defining, essentializing feature, one construed as tantamount to his inherent moral depravity. In this rendering, we can see influence from Moorish figures like Aaron, who asserts that he will, quote, have his soul black like his face. As Ian Smith has recently argued, Mully Muhammad sets a dramatic paradigm for early modern English drama, the influence of which extends to sites like Hamlet's evocations of Pyrrhus. Alcazar is perhaps best known for drawing a stark binary between its villain Mully Muhammad and his heroic uncle Abdelmelek, who is framed by an overt lack of racializing descriptors. These phenotypic binaries derive in part from Peele's source text, John Polliman's The Second Book of Battles, itself a translation of a Portuguese source. As Amberine Databoy argues, Abdelmelek's description in Polliman's account depicts the figure as, quote, the embodiment of a Renaissance Christian prince. According to Polliman's account, the heroic figure had, quote, a white face but intermixed with red, which did gallantly garnish his cheeks. Mully Muhammad garners markedly contrasting description. As Polliman's account outlines, the erstwhile king was, quote, of color so black that he was accompted of many for a Negro or Blackmore. I want to emphasize the word accompted here, an early modern form of accounted. The term in some sense gestures to the contrived nature of racial ascription, denoting the sets of assumptions and estimations that inform racial typology. Indeed, in the account offered by Polliman, many, but not all, make such a determination, bringing to mind the disparity between the nurse's estimation of Aaron and Tamara's child and Aaron's own categorization. Rather than consider Polliman's equivocations, Peele dismisses them, resolving uncertainties into essentialisms, thus enacting a particularly overt process of race-making situated at the onset of Elizabethan and Jacobean representations of Moors. The first known English account of the conflict which Peel sought to render provides some possible insight into this equivocation. According to the unattributed source, A Dolorous Discourse of a Most Terrible and Bloody Battle Fought in Barbary, Mully Muhammad, referred to in the text as Mullah Sharifa, was the product of what we might call an interracial relationship. As the report claims, quote, the cruel king Mullah Abdullah, that is Mully Muhammad's father, amongst many other taking to his wife a bondwoman that was a black Negro, had by her a son called Mullah Sharifa, who for that he was of his mother's complexion. In this description, Mully Muhammad, the first blackamoor figure known to have been rendered on the early modern English stage, might be categorized as mixed race. While it remains unclear whether or not Peel engaged the dolorous discourse, the dramatist's dismissal of Parliament's equivocations participate directly in the routines of elision that forestall consideration of mixed heritage. Parliament's equivocations and Peel's elisions bring to mind the often noted indeterminacy of the Moorish figure, a facet recognizable in the figure's at times ambiguous or unexplained background in, for example, dramatic representation. Such indeterminacy has been engaged critically, to employ Margot Hendrick's apt application of the term to our field. I'm thinking here of work like Kim F. Hall's Othello and the Problem of Blackness. But the concept of indeterminacy has also in the recent past been employed uncritically, in ways intended to cleave the figure of the Moor from considerations of racial blackness and from a long history of anti-black ideology. More recent adjustments to the U.S. Census, particularly the movement to mark one or more racial category, proceeded in part from investments to challenge the premise of rigid racial categorization. But as scholars such as Kim M. Williams and Michelle Elam have demonstrated, such a movement was readily co-opted by those politically invested in reducing, at least on paper, the non-white population. Why redress centuries of structural racism if, at least demographically speaking, there were suddenly fewer people who could be counted as belonging to groups subject to such structures? If there is a lesson to be drawn from this strategic demographic jostling employed to obfuscate rather than to address the realities of racism and racialized experience, it is one that many of us here are already deeply familiar with, that in considering the Moor's indeterminacy or the Moor's mixedness, we must remain attentive to the various processes of racialization wielded to construct the figure, including the central role of anti-black ideology. Of course, occluded by routines of emphasizing or eliding mixedness, of evacuating or essentializing black identity, is the very heterogeneity inherent to the African diaspora. Thank you.
So, first of all, wow. I mean, what a way to close us out. That was incredible. I'm thinking back to the earlier part of your talk. I think mixedness was kind of a through line today. I think in the middle two papers, maybe in ontological ways, but in the other two in more biological ways. But I hadn't really ever considered or encountered anything that would say mixedness among people would result in impotency, basically. And I'm just wondering, perhaps outside the scope of what you're doing here, if there's a way that that's specifically gendered, or, if this is maybe feminizing mixed men in a way through male sterility, or and then becoming insulting in that way, or if it's sort of more the burden of sterility is on women, or if it's more unilaterally applied.
I mean, that's it's a really interesting question, because one of the things that you're raising is how gendered conversations about interracial relationships and mixedness have historically been, drawing back at the very least to early modern English representation, and certainly earlier. We were having a conversation yesterday, a few of us, about the the real emphasis on interracial pairings between, for example, Black men and white women in early modern drama, right? This is a point that that scholars have sort of worked through in a lot of generative ways. But to sort of, to address your question, I think one of the things that that is fascinating about looking at some of these scientific racist theories, right? The sort of like these absurd ideas, are the way in which they fluctuate. And so, for example, Josiah C. Nott believed that, or, argued that mixed race people were frailer. Also argued that that the slave plantation was the healthiest place for African descended people. And so, and what you can see there, right, is a kind of back and forth to really suit the needs of a slave-holding class and of a slaveholder. And I think legislation and one place I might say is like Jennifer L. Morgan has just incredible work on some of these early American legislation and its sort of its impact. But legislation is gendered in that way. Certainly, what are called so-called quote unquote anti-miscegenation laws, as compared to laws determining that a child follow the condition of the mother, are particularly gendered with respect to racial mixing.
Well, thank you so much for this, Kyle. This fits in beautifully with what we've been talking about today, especially with Tamara's talk earlier. And one of the things that talk left me thinking about is the weird resistance in the English tradition to a full language of mixedness, right? It sounds clumsy and artificial, where you have a whole discourse of mestizaje. In Spanish, you have métissage in French, but somehow English resists the category, right? And as though it wants to resist the possibility. They think of indigenous and English mixing on this continent. And then all of the places where the English have put their colonial foot, and yet no word, no category, a real continued, almost aggressive resistance to the fact that this must have been going on. And so one of the things your talk made me think about with the early modern precedents is, though we tend to skip over Pocahontas as a historical figure, but if we think of that moment, how seemingly unproblematic it was for her to marry Rolfe and produce a child, and that child's legitimacy never be questioned. The only concern seems to have been that he was not of a high enough rank to marry a princess in the way the English were thinking. And it also made me think of the careful post-Inca genealogies done by the Spanish of royalty, of indigenous royalty in Peru. Where is all of that in relationship to Blackness? And, aren't there Black kings and queens, et cetera? And so there's this, somewhere in the English system, it really crashes and burns in a way that I still can't get my head around. But even when you're talking about 19th century legislation, there's a curious footnote for Virginia anti-miscegenation laws, which exempt any descendants of Pocahontas as a legal thing. And that includes President Woodrow Wilson's wife, who traced her lineage back to Pocahontas. Anyway, just a curiosity. But I'm wondering, the whole linguistic thing is really catches me. Thank you.
It's such a generative question. And I'm thinking, I think you're exactly right. The sort of today's set of conversations, Tamara's talk this morning, really demonstrates the various ways in which these issues are approached. And the first thing that comes to mind when you mention this sort of, this English resistance is this moment in The Tempest, right? Where, the sort of the group of Italians say that Clarabelle, the king's daughter, has been lost on an African, and they're talking about a marriage that, that would have been between, right, royal, right, a kind of aristocratic, and the phrase is lost, right? There really is a kind of English resistance. I think that that's right, and I'm thinking in part of the work on like the Spanish Black legend, ideas of the English looking to the Spanish as an already mixed population and using that in denigratory ways. I'm thinking of the work of Noemi and Di, and sort of, just unpacking that, and the way in which that fiction, that fantasy persists, and arguably persists into, the sort of the site that will become the United States, right? That settler colony kind of framing, chattel slavery framing, it persists even amid these very clear, right? I mean, Douglas's writing here is so clear about the ways in which that sort of resistance is all built on a fiction. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Kyle. That was amazing. And when you mentioned Jennifer Morgan and numeracy, I thought about counting bodies and population, and how population meant the loss of people in the early modern period because of a biblical prohibition not to count people, and how early Americanists like Jennifer Morgan and Molly Farrell say that the chattel slavery, indigenous removal, kind of shifted this biblical prohibition, and people started, there was like counting bodies, counting census. And what fascinated me about your talk is that you can see that how in Aaron and the nurse and Caliban's embodiment, there is wrestling with that kind of how do we count these children? Are they swarms? Are they hordes? Are they people? And I wanted to think with you and ask you if you've thought about counting people as a kind of, whether pedagogical, how you acquire, numeracy, how that also plays into the calculus that you are providing.
Thanks for that question. I think pointing to that moment in thinking about that moment in Titus, this way that it, this shifting way of accounting for one individual and how that can have a cascading effect does seem to be something. It's one of the things I'm thinking through that the early modern English are thinking about, which is what happens if you have a sort of site of indeterminacy, that you can adjust it and that can have a sort of longer effect. But also, that moment being one in which, right, to the point about Caliban, this idea of peopling the island, right? And I'm thinking here of like Urvashi's essay on this, and just the idea here that part of what's also being worked out are categories of dehumanization, right, versus the sort of creation of, and this is, I'm thinking here of the work of Jennifer L. Morgan, like the rational European subject, right? That there's also what's at, with language about, who would be counted, why, how, in what way, and in particular with thinking specifically about the transatlantic trade in human beings, commodified and dehumanized. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really incredible paper. I just found it really interesting. So thank you so much. I was just wondering, so something that was interesting about the plays that you were looking at, and also something that I was thinking about in the context of your conversation on mixedness is an Ottoman practice of mixedness, which I'm not sure if you've looked at all, which, I mean, it's not sure if you've encountered it, but basically in the Ottoman Empire, the dynasty kind of perpetuated itself by only, the Ottoman emperors would only procreate with enslaved captives. And that was a way of ensuring the integrity of the empire and sort of preserving or preventing the need to share power. So they drew on this kind of history of concubine. So the question, and I was just thinking about that relationship between a master and a captive, and then the two plays that you've looked at, which also allude to mixed race in the context of master and sort of enslaved or captive. So I was just wondering, generally in the kinds of mixedness that you're thinking about, or the plays that you're looking at, or the texts, what are the dynamics in terms of like maybe class and nation, in terms of the relationships between couples that are kind of generating mixedness, if you see patterns, or if there's anything interesting, any kind of thoughts that you have on that? Yeah.
No, I mean, one of the things that you're bringing to mind is just part of, I'm just thinking about early American legislation. Part of what that is working to calcify is to restrict the inheritance, to restrict heritability of not just European lineage, but also, if we're talking about, like landowning, property, moneyed, otherwise, right, or aristocratic men, to sever paternal responsibility, and to which is a complete, reversal of English law prior. The other thing that your point is making me think about, one, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, so thanks for raising that. But one of the things I also find interesting is how the even in, for example, English readings of the Battle of Alcazar, and thinking about the space of Morocco, and thinking about that, part of what I think the record demonstrates is the way in which the English, and you spoke about this earlier today in such insightful ways, but just a misreading, like a cultural misreading, a religious misreading, right? That in some ways feels almost intentional, and in many ways really serves the sort of a project of constructing English identity. And I think even in records, thinking about the space of, for example, North Africa, that readings of the presence of people we might identify as being West or Sub-Saharan African are really being rethought on English terms to forward that construction of English identity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this. It's so generative in so many different directions, in part because of the tensions and the logical inconsistencies that you're kind of drawing our attention to as they unfold across time and place. And I could ask lots of questions related to that. But one of the things that I was especially intrigued by over the course of your presentation is that you give us this sort of centuries-long history of racial thinking in the Anglophone kind of world, broadly speaking. And one of the passages that you quoted from, I thought was really interesting. I can't remember exactly the text that you pulled it from, but it said, "Had nature lent thee but thy mother's look, thou might have been an emperor," which suggests to me that there was a moment, at least in this racial thinking, where there was a degree of openness to the possibility of incorporating people of mixed ancestry in ways that didn't kind of relegate them to enslavement or relegate the kind of nation to doom based on aspect, right, rather than on ancestry. So there seems to be in the 17th century moment, I think it might be 17th century, but maybe 18th century moment, a degree of openness or at least flexibility that then by the 1850s, in that census case that you give us, is more rigid, more fixed, more pessimistic too. And I wonder if you see it that way, this sort of arc from flexibility, openness to rigidity and pessimism, and what might account for that change over time, and like what sort of kind of historical moments might help to kind of mark those changes over time.
I mean, yeah, that's such a generative question, and it's immediately making me think of your talk this morning, and immediately making me think of that that 8 generations, and what you pointed out is this really qualified, like after 8 generations of following this, really rigid paradigm, that there's still a qualified whiteness. There's still, as you pointed out, there is a marking that persists through that. And, one of the things I think, even from Titus Andronicus, or even from that moment, is in that moment of what we might think of working through the potentials for different outcomes. There is in that play, as many of you know, there is reference to a child that can pass, a mixed child that can pass, and one of the things that's interesting about that, I think, is that the child is named as mixed, and so even if even in terms of aspect, and the idea is to swap that child actually, so that it can be the emperor's child, and to think about the way in which that marking then sets a paradigm in place to suggest like maybe there's flexibility, but that will still, there's still a marking. So I think what Aaron says is my countryman Mulattos. So he tells us that this child who would pass for white is mixed, and then marks that child in this way that reminded me so much of, as you were talking about, this 8 generations, this long, fantasy, this idea here that even after 8 generations, there remains a kind of marking. And I think that keeps arising even in early modern English sort of discourses around that. Thanks for that question.
Hi, Kyle.
Hi, Miles.
So I have 2 questions. I'm going to try to keep them very separate. The first one has to do with the depiction of infants on the early modern stage. So it's my understanding that they rarely appeared, and often it was either a kind of doll or just the swaddling, just the so as you were talking, I was sort of thinking, well, this is sort of fascinating. You've got this child of a black father and a white mother, whom we know to be Aaron's child because it's black like the father. But in terms of what's physically brought on stage, my own suspicion is that it's blankets with nothing inside, right? So the kind of unrepresentability, I mean, we're back to your presentation where the child is actually absent. And that whole scene has this sort of Abbott and Costello. What are you carrying in your arms, nurse? What do you think, Aaron? Like there's this big, long, it's a delivery. Who delivered? I mean, it's this long kind of bit before she finally says, "It's your baby, Blackie." I mean, you know what I mean? Like, and so I wondered what you would have to say about the kind of perhaps the unrepresentability of this child, one, and then total separate question, but inspired by the way you're going from early modern to early American. There are these enslaved Muslims who get caught up in the slave trade and who get released when their literacy is discovered, right? And in the case of I think it's Omar ibn Said in the 19th century, they go, the sort of white people that free him go to great lengths to write, he's not really a Negro. So I'm curious if you found anything that suggests that early modern English people thought of the areas in which the slave trade happened as areas in which racial mixture had already occurred, and that you could see someone who seemed to be a Negro, but they were actually, forgive me for using this term, but part Arab, right? Or, part something else. So those are the 2 questions.
Miles, when you talk about, thinking about that staging, right? Titus is really, as a play, there are so many sort of unusual aspects of Titus that really don't get repeated. For example, even the sort of staging of an explicitly mixed race figure is really, is really sort of, that's where we would go to Titus for that. And, to your point, I think, right, it is what's happening with that child is there are these various estimations. And I think, right, to your point, that wouldn't be like necessarily represented, that child wouldn't necessarily be represented in a kind of concrete way. Really speaks to the kinds of discourse that arise around the child, right? That you're getting others' readings of the child, and then what those possibilities are that are raised by those readings. In which direction do they head, and what do they say about heritability, and what do they say about the construction of identity we might call European or English. And I just think that's such a great point. The other thing that your question's making me think of, this isn't a direct answer to your question. I'm also thinking in part of going to early America and thinking about, and the work of Ty Miles is coming to mind right now. And the way in which the way in which chattel slavery at times was not exclusive very early, right, to specifically African descended people, but that in terms of population and demographic or constructed ideas, we begin to see a shift. That, of course, is never, because of the reality of racial mixing, is, a construct just like the boundaries of race are a construct, but to actually track that kind of shift and to think about the ways in which that begins to construct a particular kind of racial category. And that, and even that, later on, right, the concept of African American, right, becoming, as in some sense, really speaking to the creation of a particular population that is essentialized, right, but that represents, real heterogeneity.
Thank you so much, Carl, for this paper. It's just absolutely amazing and really, really generative to think with. So I had just a couple of questions. The first was I was really, really struck by the way in which you're sort of drawing out some of this language of accounting, the attempt to sort of taxonomize, the attempt to account, right? The language that we've already seen, right? Half me, half my dad, but to sort of place it in the context that you're doing, and then also to think about it within these lineages that Tamara was talking about, and also the language of accounting that you were pulling out from people. It's just that's so fantastic. And on the one hand, I was about to say it's sort of the way in which that doesn't work, the way in which that doesn't quite succeed in some of the ways I think that Scott was pointing us to, and yet, as you're suggesting, it's so deeply imbricated within these sort of larger global contexts, but also these larger histories. My question, thinking about Tamara's presentation, but then going all the way back to our first paper from Miles, is really about indeterminacy, probably predictably. And I'm thinking about the way, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of desire for determinacy, the desire to maybe read the body in some of the ways that Miles was talking about, and the resistances, the inability to do that. One of the sort of images that pops into my head as I'm even talking about this, again, thinking about the afterlife, the legacies, the genealogies, if you will, of what you're talking about, are some of those pictures that emerge in the 19th century, the enslaved children of Isaac and Rosa, for instance, a kind of anxiety about the way in which you can't read mixedness, and that's the problem right there. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about indeterminacy and the sort of desire to read the body, the desire to sort of interpret the body, as Miles would say, and our inability to maybe do so.
First, I mean, thank you for catching the accounting. That phrase from Parliament's Second Book of Battles, I think, is so. It's it just feels so overtly representative of race making. The idea that the figure Mali Muhammad was a compted of many for a Negro or Blackamoor. So the idea that there's an estimation and a kind of a process of reading the body, and then the fact that Peel really does away with the equivocation and simply counts, just says, well, then this figure counts in this way, and then that being a kind of point in the this lineage of Moors. And I think that word counting and that idea of accounting carries a kind of objectivity to it, even though in that moment it is clearly not objective. And your question about indeterminacy, I mean, I think, I was thinking, this morning during Tamara's talk, just looking at that 8 generations represented by that Costa painting, and thinking about the ways in which that can't possibly represent a real experience, that the idea that could be controlled or that could be taxonomized, and Tamara, your paper just did such a fascinating job walking us through the way that in the real world, the sort of the reality of the irreconcilability of those things would then be deployed. You could call into question. And I just, again, I'm just still thinking about that paper and looking forward to talking about it. I think in relation to that, this notion of indeterminacy, I think I've been thinking a lot about how, at least in the English record and in some early modern English drama, that if that indeterminacy can be wielded strategically as a means to frame and reframe populations. And I'm thinking then later of the example from Edward Long saying, well, mixed race people can't reproduce. But then in England, the idea that of course mixed race people can reproduce. And in fact, it is so, that mixedness is not a sort of thing that can be, really, in some sense restricted. And and thinking immediately, well, after a few generations, England will look like this. Really demonstrating that indeterminacy being sort of used as a fear, and then also that indeterminacy, being sort of used strategically. But I think the broader question of indeterminacy and that you're raising is one of how it's approached on a scholarly level. If it's approached critically, which is to say to understand the ways in which race making can capitalize on indeterminacy. And then, of course, the uncritical way that it can be approached and has been in the recent past, which is to say, well, if something's indeterminate, is race really operating here? That you can use indeterminacy to evacuate. You can suddenly take an instance that otherwise is clear instance of racialization and say, well, it's flexible. And so can we really say there's racialization happening here? And I think, just to return to, this idea here at the end of those 8th generations, the remaining marking. And I think, with Titus, the marking of a child who passes as also being the child of one of Aaron's countrymen. So saying to still attempt to put a kind of boundary on that demonstrates that even at levels where you would imagine, well, this child could be passed as the emperor's child, that there is still, the place still marks the child. It really puts a boundary on the limits of that indeterminacy. Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much. And it seems that sort of disciplinary intervention about mixedness and our own refusal to sort of, or the legacy of refusing to sit with indeterminacy might be a good place to stop, because it's such a mic drop moment. So thank you so much, Kyle. Please join me in thanking you.